In human history, there are places where reason ceased and suffering became the norm. Camps where thousands were stripped of their identities and where life was reduced to a number branded onto their skin. But concentration camps did not originate with Nazism. Their roots go back much further to forgotten wars and empires that discovered mass confinement could be a tool of control. From the first British camps in South Africa to the Soviet gulags and the complexes of the Third Reich, the history of concentration camps is also the story of how power learned to organize cruelty. This is the origin of concentration camps. The origin of concentration camps, the system of suffering. In the history of humankind, pain was not always an accident. Often it was planned. Throughout the centuries, empires learned that control of the body could be the most effective way to dominate the mind, and from that idea, as simple as it was sinister, one of the cruelest instruments of modern power was born, the concentration camp. Unlike traditional prisons, camps were not created to punish individuals for a crime, but to imprison entire groups of people for what they represented, their race, their ideology, or simply for belonging to the wrong side of history. They were a political tool, a way to reorganize society to suit the state's needs. The camp did not seek justice, it sought obedience. The 19th century witnessed great transformations, the rise of nationalism, European colonial expansion, and wars for world domination. And in the midst of this maelstrom of power and ambition, a new military logic emerged, total war, where not only armies but also civilian populations fought. It was then that the concept of the concentration camp began to take shape. First as an improvisation, then as a system, until it became a perfectly designed machine for breaking the human spirit. The term concentration camp first appeared during the 19th century, when European imperial powers sought to crush colonial rebellions. The idea was to concentrate the civilian population in controlled areas, separating them from enemy combatants, to deprive the rebels of food, shelter, and support. It was a military strategy disguised as humanitarian necessity. The leaders of the time justified it as a measure of protection, but in practice it became a policy of hunger, disease, and slow death. In these places there were no laws, no rights, only fences, guards and orders. Civilians, the elderly, women and children were treated as enemies of the state. Locked up in subhuman conditions, without water or food, they were victims of epidemics, mistreatment and summary executions. Unbeknownst to them, the world was witnessing the birth of the system of suffering, a modern administrative form of dehumanization. Over time, this system would be perfected. The first colonial camps in Cuba and South Africa would become the laboratories of horror in the 20th century. There, the same ideas that totalitarian regimes in Europe would adopt decades later were tested. Mass confinement, the separation of families, forced labor, and anonymous death. Concentration camps did not arise from the madness of a single man or a single regime. They were the result of an evolution, the application of modern rationality to the control of human beings. The state discovered that suffering could be organized, counted, and planned, and that behind a barbed wire fence, not only a person could disappear, but an entire identity. When the Allies liberated the camps of the Third Reich in 1945, the world believed it had discovered hell for the first time. But the truth was more disturbing. That hell had a history, a long, systematic, and human history. Because concentration camps didn't originate in Germany. Only there did they reach their most industrial and ruthless form. The origin of the horror wasn't an accident, but a process, a chain of ideas that, step by step, transformed military logic into a method of extermination. And understanding how that path began is essential to understanding how evil can become systemic. The first fields of modern history. At the end of the 19th century, the world began to change radically. European empires competed for territories, resources, and political power in a race that transformed the map of the planet. Colonial wars, fought in distant regions, pitted not only armies against each other but entire populations. In this context, an idea emerged that would mark the beginning of a new era of control and repression, the concentration of civilians in closed compounds under military guard. This was the birth of the first concentration camps in modern history. The first recognized instance is found on the island of Cuba during the War of Independence against Spain. In 1896, General Valeriano Weyler, appointed Captain General of Cuba, faced a guerrilla war waged by Cuban insurgents. Unable to distinguish between combatants and civilians, Weyler decided to implement a brutal policy, reconcentration. He ordered all peasants to be removed from rural areas and concentrated in towns under Spanish control to isolate the insurgents from any support. This measure, justified as a military strategy, ended up being a humanitarian catastrophe. Thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes without adequate food or shelter. The makeshift camps around the cities were filled with hunger, disease, and death. In less than 2 years, it is estimated that between 150,000 and 300,000 civilians died, a horrifying figure for the time. The international press, especially in the United States, began to denounce Weyler's barbarity, and his actions earned him the nickname the Butcher of Cuba. However, the concept he had created, that of concentrating civilians in controlled enclosures, would be adopted and refined by other powers. Just a few years later, in the far south of Africa, the British Empire would face its own challenge, the Second Boer War. The Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, resisted British expansion in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Unable to easily defeat them in open combat, the British resorted to a familiar tactic, depriving enemy fighters of civilian support. It was then that General Lord Kitchener implemented a systematic plan of internment. Thousands of Boer women and children were arrested and confined in concentration camps scattered throughout the territory. Conditions were deplorable: tents in arid terrain, water shortages, rationed food, and diseases such as typhus and dysentery. The figures were devastating. More than 120,000 civilians were interned, and it is estimated that around 26,000 died, mostly women and children. What distinguished the British camps from the Spanish ones in Cuba was their level of organization. Kitchener created an administrative system with censuses, lists, and regulations that transformed suffering into a bureaucratic process. It was the rationalization of horror. Instead of an improvised act of war, it was a planned and controlled policy. And although on the surface they were called refuge camps, the reality was a death camp. Photographs taken by missionaries and journalists showing starving Boer children and dying women shocked British and European public opinion, but they also revealed something deeper: the birth of a model. The modern concentration camp was no longer an improvisation, but a strategic tool with military, political, and social objectives. In them, civilians ceased to be people and became elements within a power equation. Suffering became a method, and mass control was transformed into an accepted practice within the logic of imperialism. The British camps in South Africa were, in a way, a 20th century laboratory. There, the idea of managing dehumanization, of registering, feeding, or letting people die according to the needs of the state, was tested for the first time. Decades later, that same structure, with lists, barracks, censuses, and identification numbers, would be replicated in the Nazi camps. But in 1902, when the Boer War ended, the world still did not grasp the full scope of what had been born. The concentration camp was already a reality, and although many considered it an anomaly of war, it had truly become the prelude to a new form of institutionalized violence. From then on, modern empires knew that total control of a population did not necessarily require battles. It was enough to surround, guard, and let die. Thus, the concept of the concentration camp became ingrained in history like a shadow that would grow with the century, waiting for its moment to reach its darkest form in the years to come. World War I, the expansion of the concept. When World War I erupted in 1914, the world was plunged into total war, one in which not only armies fought on the front lines, but entire nations mobilized for the destruction of the enemy. This industrial, protracted, and bloody war generated a new kind of human landscape: millions of displaced persons, prisoners, and suspects whom governments decided to control through a mechanism that already had precedents in Cuba and South Africa, but which would now reach an unprecedented scale: internment camps. If concentration camps had been colonial tools at the end of the 19th century, World War I brought them to the heart of Europe. From the first months of the conflict, both the Central Powers and the Allies began establishing prisoner-of-war camps, places intended to hold captured soldiers. However, the concept soon expanded. Fear of espionage, political paranoia, and exacerbated nationalism led governments to also intern civilians considered internal enemies. Germans in France, French in Germany, Austro-Hungarians in Russia, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, all could be seen as threats simply because of their origins. Thus was born mass civilian internment, a practice that transformed the social landscape of the war. In Germany, one of the first camps was established in Ruhleben, near Berlin, where thousands of British civilians residing in the country when the war broke out were interned. Many of them were tourists, workers or merchants, people with no connection whatsoever to military activities. The German authorities converted a racetrack into a makeshift camp surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers. There, some 5,500 men spent years detained, enduring a precarious existence in barracks and makeshift schools or sports clubs. In the British Empire, the situation was similar. England and its dominions established camps for German and Austro-Hungarian citizens living within their territories. On the Isle of Man, for example, enormous internment camps like Knockalow were built, which at its peak held more than 23,000 people. These civilian prisoners were watched day and night, subjected to forced labor or kept in unsanitary conditions, often without having been formally charged with any crime. Thousands of Germans residing in Canada, Australia, and South Africa suffered the same fate, treated as enemies simply because of their nationality. In Russia, the Tsarist Empire also used camps to intern both captured soldiers and ethnic minorities suspected of sympathizing with the enemy. Tens of thousands of Poles, Balts, Volga Germans and Jews were displaced or confined to remote regions of Siberia under extreme conditions. In some cases, internment became a slow death sentence from hunger or cold, but perhaps the most dramatic and brutal case of this period occurred in the Ottoman Empire, where, under the cover of war, one of the first genocides of the 20th century took place, the Armenian Genocide. Between 1915 and 1917, the Young Turk government ordered the mass deportation of the Armenian population to the Syrian desert, where thousands were concentrated in camps like Deir ez-Zor. These were not temporary internment camps, but veritable extermination camps, where starvation, disease, and violence killed them. It is estimated that more than 1 million Armenians died in this process. Unlike the European camps, which maintained a degree of legality under the Hague Convention, the Ottoman camps operated outside any legal framework, foreshadowing what decades later would be known as the killing camp. The First World War was, therefore, a laboratory for mass control. The camps were no longer just a colonial instrument or an emergency measure. They became a political and administrative tool for managing entire populations deemed problematic. With lists, censuses, and regulations, states began to classify, separate, and isolate people according to criteria of nationality, ethnicity, or loyalty. For the first time, internment ceased to be an exception and became a state policy. When the conflict ended in 1918, Europe was exhausted. Millions of people had spent years behind barbed wire fences under constant surveillance in conditions of hunger and disease. Many never returned home. However, the precedent had been set. Governments had discovered that the camps were an effective way to control, punish, or simply make entire groups disappear without the need for trials or public executions. World War I expanded the concept of the concentration camp, normalized it, and integrated it into the machinery of modern power. What began as a temporary measure in times of crisis would soon become a permanent instrument in the hands of authoritarian regimes. The world didn't yet know it, but within the barbed wire of Ruhleben, Knockalow, and Deir ez-Zor, the model that 20th century totalitarian regimes would take to its extreme was being forged. Systematic confinement, bureaucratic dehumanization, and the idea that with sufficient order and moral distance it was possible to manage the suffering of millions of human beings. Soviet camps, terror under another name. Following the end of the Russian Revolution and the consolidation of Bolshevik power, a new form of state repression spread across the vast territory of the Soviet Union. The Gulag was born, an acronym for Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagerai, Main Directorate of Camps, a network of forced labor camps that for decades symbolized the hidden face of Soviet communism. Although its existence was officially justified as part of the re-education process and the construction of socialism, in practice the camp system became a tool of terror, control, and silent extermination. Its origins can be traced back to the early years of the Bolshevik regime. In 1919, in the midst of the Civil War, Lenin authorized the creation of the first concentration camps for enemies of the revolution: former nobles, Tsarist officers, political opponents, and rebellious peasants. One of the first was Arkhangelsk in the frozen north, where prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions. In 1923, the Solovki camp, established in a former monastery on the White Sea Islands, became the model for the future Gulag camps. There, the practices of isolation, forced labor, indoctrination, and extermination by physical exhaustion were tested, practices that would later be replicated throughout the country. During the 1920s, the camp system was still limited, but with Stalin's rise to absolute power, it transformed into a colossal machine. In the 1930s, during the Great Purges, the Gulag expanded massively. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens were arrested on charges of sabotage, espionage, or enmity against the people. Intellectuals, Red Army officers, workers, peasants, and even members of the Communist Party were swept up in the machinery of terror. Arrests were arbitrary, confessions obtained under torture, and sentences handed down by secret tribunals. Once convicted, prisoners were sent to camps scattered throughout the Soviet Union: Vorkuta, Kolyma, Norilsk, Magadan, Karaganda, Perm, names that became synonymous with extreme suffering. The camps were mostly located in inhospitable regions: Siberia, the Arctic, or Central Asia. The journey to them was a brutal experience. Prisoners were transported for weeks in sealed wagons without food or water, piled up like cattle. Many died before arriving. Once inside the Gulag, labor was mandatory and grueling. Mines were dug, forests were felled, and canals and railways were built, all in temperatures that could plummet to 40 degrees Celsius. Workdays lasted between 12 and 16 hours, and food rations depended on productivity. Those who failed to meet their work quota simply starved to death. Death in the Gulag was commonplace. Cold, hunger, disease, accidents, and punishments reduced life expectancy to just a few months. Despite this, the system wasn't entirely hidden. The Soviet state justified it as a means of re-education through labor. It is estimated that more than 18 million people were interned in the Gulag at some point, of whom at least 1.6 million officially died, although the real numbers could be much higher. The Gulag was not only a penal system, but also an economic and political tool. The camps were integrated into the Soviet economy. They built dams, factories, and entire cities. The White Sea Canal, inaugurated in 1933 and presented as a triumph of socialism, was built with the labor of more than 170,000 prisoners, tens of thousands of whom died during its construction. Stalin presented these projects as symbols of progress while concealing the human cost behind every brick. During World War II, the system did not disappear. The prisoners of the Gulag were used as forced labor to sustain the war effort, manufacturing weapons, building railways, and exploiting natural resources essential to the Red Army. After the Soviet victory, the network of camps was even expanded. Thousands of German prisoners of war, Axis soldiers, and suspected collaborators were sent to the same places where internal enemies of communism had once died. After Stalin's death in 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev attempted to usher in a new era in Soviet history. In his famous secret speech of 1956, he denounced some of the regime's abuses, condemned the cult of personality surrounding Stalin, and ordered the release of millions of prisoners. That gesture, though historic, did not erase decades of terror. For many, freedom came too late. Those who survived the camps returned to a country that no longer recognized them. Many were met with suspicion, treated as suspects, and marginalized by a society that preferred to forget what had happened in the frozen lands of Kolyma, Vorkuta, or Norilsk. The trauma of the Gulag was already etched into the memory of the Soviet people, a deep wound that spanned generations. It destroyed not only bodies, but also souls. Fear, mistrust, and silence became the invisible foundations upon which the Soviet Union was rebuilt. The families of the internees were stigmatized, their children monitored, their names erased from records, and their pain condemned to secrecy. To speak of the Gulag was dangerous, to remember it an act of courage. For years, only whispers in kitchens and clandestine testimonies kept the memory of that system alive. It was thanks to voices like that of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, author of the Gulag Archipelago, that the world was able to grasp the magnitude of the horror. His work revealed what the regime had tried to conceal, a network of thousands of camps scattered across Soviet territory, where millions of men and women were imprisoned. Women were reduced to mere numbers, enslaved in the name of socialist progress. Solzhenitsyn showed that the Gulag was not an aberration of the system, but an essential part of it. Forced labor served not only as punishment, but as an economic and political engine, a tool to sustain the state apparatus and purge anyone considered an enemy of the people. Through the Gulag, the regime achieved what no empire had ever managed before: control not only of bodies, but also of minds. Fear became a form of government, a constant presence that dissolved human bonds and fractured the moral fabric of Soviet society. Germany before the Holocaust. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany was a wounded nation, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles and deeply divided by economic and political crisis. The Weimar Republic was crumbling under the weight of unemployment, inflation, and the fear of communism. In this context of chaos and resentment, the National Socialist German Workers' Party promised to restore national pride and eliminate those it considered responsible for the country's decline. That same year, just weeks after Hitler assumed the chancellorship, the Nazi regime began laying the foundations of its repressive machinery. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag fire, the German parliament, served as a pretext for declaring a state of emergency and suspending civil liberties. Within days, thousands of political opponents were arrested: communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and anyone else who might pose a threat to the new order. The state police, the Gestapo, still in formation, lacked the capacity to handle so many prisoners, so a new form of mass detention was employed: concentration camps. Thus, on March 22, 1933, Dachau on the outskirts of Munich was inaugurated, considered the first official concentration camp of the Third Reich. In the words of Heinrich Himmler, then head of the Bavarian police, Dachau would be the model and the school of the future National Socialist state. It was not an extermination camp, at least not yet, but an instrument of terror intended to re-educate and break the enemies of the regime. Initially, the inmates were almost exclusively political prisoners: communists, social democrats, critical journalists, or religious dissidents. They were subjected to forced labor, exemplary punishments, and constant humiliation. But the most important thing was the message: anyone could end up in a camp if they defied the Führer. Dachau marked the beginning of a system that would soon spread throughout Germany. Within months, camps like Oranienburg, Esterwegen, Sachsenburg, and Lichtenberg emerged, initially administered by the SA, the Nazi Party's stormtroopers, until 1934, when, after the purge of the Night of the Long Knives, Heinrich Himmler and the SS assumed total control of the system. The SS transformed the camps into a hierarchical structure with rules, ranks, and an efficient bureaucracy. The camp ceased to be a simple detention center and became a laboratory of terror. Methods of surveillance, punishment, and indoctrination were tested there, methods that would later be applied on a continental scale. Prisoners were identified by colored triangles sewn onto their uniforms: red for politicians, green for criminals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for homosexuals, and black for those considered asocial, an ambiguous category that could include anyone from beggars to single women. Meanwhile, the regime was advancing its program of racial cleansing. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws institutionalized discrimination against Jews. They were stripped of their citizenship, forbidden from marrying Aryans, and excluded from public life. These laws sought not only to marginalize, but also to brand an entire population as a foreign body within the state. Concentration camps began to reflect this ideological transformation. By the late 1930s, they housed not only political dissidents, but also those whom the regime considered racially or biologically undesirable. With the outbreak of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938, the repression reached a new level. In just 2 days, hundreds of synagogues were destroyed, thousands of Jewish businesses were looted, and more than 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. For the first time, the camps were filled with Jewish prisoners simply for being Jewish. That wave marked the point of no return. The Nazi state had crossed the line separating legal persecution from physical repression. By then, the camps were no longer political improvisations, but an integral part of the system. The SS had perfected their administration and their brutality. Punishments were ritualistic, experiments with human endurance commonplace. The objective was not only to punish, but to destroy the will, to strip the individual of their humanity. Every blow, every humiliation served to reinforce the message that the National Socialist state could decide who deserved to live and who should disappear. In 1939, at the start of World War II, Germany had 6 major concentration camps and dozens of subcamps. What had begun as a tool of political control had become a system of racial and social oppression. The camps were already a rehearsal for a larger and more sinister project, the creation of a society purified by ideology. However, in those early years, the genocide was not yet underway. The Nazi state was building the administrative, logistical, and psychological foundations of what was to come. The commanders, guards, and bureaucrats of the SS were being trained, without fully realizing it, to direct the machinery of extermination that in a few years would devour Europe. Germany before the Holocaust was, in essence, a laboratory of horror, a space where political repression was transformed into racial politics, and where the idea of the concentration camp evolved from an instrument of control to a mechanism of annihilation. Every order signed, every camp built, every prisoner humiliated was one more step toward darkness. The Holocaust did not emerge overnight. It was the result of years of practice, of progressive dehumanization, and of a bureaucracy that learned to turn cruelty into routine. The architecture of horror, how a Nazi camp was built. The architecture of Nazi concentration camps did not emerge from chaos or improvisation, but from meticulous bureaucratic planning designed to optimize repression, control, and later systematic annihilation. From their first structures in 1933, such as Dachau, to the industrial complexes of Auschwitz and Majdanek, the architectural evolution of the camps reflected the transformation of the Nazi regime, from political persecution to the machinery of genocide. It all began with a cold administrative logic, where SS architects and civil engineers worked hand in hand with the Gestapo to create spaces where the efficiency of forced labor and dehumanization coexisted. Dachau, originally conceived as a camp for political prisoners, served as a model for all those that followed. Its design consisted of a main entrance with guard towers, electrified fences, a series of symmetrically aligned barracks, and, at the rear, the labor and punishment facilities. The layout was not accidental. It reflected a visual ideology of order and discipline. Each block represented the absolute control of the individual within a closed system where there was no escape or privacy. As the Nazi system expanded, the camps became veritable cities of terror, built with military precision. In Auschwitz, for example, the main camp, Auschwitz the Hun, was established in a former Polish army barracks, but it was soon expanded with Auschwitz II Birkenau, a vast complex designed from scratch by SS engineers and the civilian company Topfund Söhne, the same company that manufactured the crematoria. There, the architecture of extermination reached its most extreme form. A network of barbed wire fences, internal railways, selection ramps, and buildings divided into specific functions: housing, labor, extermination, cremation, all designed to maximize the efficiency of death. The arrival of the deportees followed a carefully established route. The train entered directly into the camp. The prisoners were separated by age and physical condition. Those fit for work were sent to the barracks, and the rest were led to the gas chambers under the pretext of a shower. In a matter of hours, thousands could be murdered without disrupting the camp's routine. The architectural design also played a psychological role. The entrance with the infamous slogan "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free, was not only a macabre irony but a manipulative device. It offered the illusion of a possibility of redemption within a system designed to destroy. The watchtowers, spotlights, and electric fences served not only to prevent escapes, but also to constantly remind the prisoners of their utter helplessness. Every element, from the layout of the barracks to the location of the latrines, responded to a logic of degradation and control. Even the paths were laid out so that the prisoners always passed under the watchful eyes of the guards. The construction of the camps was carried out in most cases with slave labor. The first prisoners were forced to build the very places where they would later be confined or executed. At Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, thousands died during the construction phase, working tirelessly, without proper tools, and without sufficient food. The barracks were usually made of wood or cheap brick, with low ceilings and poor ventilation. The aim was not to keep the prisoners alive, but to exploit them while they were useful. The camp infrastructure was divided into zones: the prisoner zone, the SS administration zone, and the associated industrial or agricultural facilities. In many cases, German companies built factories within or next to the camps, connected by internal roads to facilitate the transport of slave laborers. Auschwitz III Monowitz, for example, was built to supply the synthetic rubber plant of IG Farben, an industrial giant that profited directly from the concentration camp system. The architectural evolution of the Nazi system led to the creation of specialized sub-camps, some for mining work, others for medical experiments, and the most lethal for mass extermination. Sobibor, Belzec, and Treblinka were built following similar plans. Small death stations camouflaged in forests, with a central path called the Tube that led the victims directly to the gas chambers. There were no barracks or work infrastructure, only the bare minimum necessary to kill quickly and conceal the evidence. In these camps, architecture served not for living but for dying. In short, the Nazi concentration camps were engineering marvels of terror. Their design combined technical precision with ideological perversion, transforming architecture, a discipline conceived to build and protect, into a tool of destruction and death. Every brick, every barbed wire fence, every watchtower represented an idea, the absolute power of the state over the human body and life. What began as a simple network of political prisons ended up being an industrialized extermination system, where architectural efficiency was placed at the service of the most monstrous crime in history. The Nazi system, the horror industry. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Nazi concentration camp system entered a new phase, one of total expansion, of horror planned as an integral part of the state. What began as a tool to punish political opponents within Germany became a transnational network of repression, enslavement, and extermination. The German army advanced across Europe, and behind it, the SS and the Gestapo established the Reich's new racial order. With each occupied country, new camps were built: Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Norway, the Netherlands, all under the same principle: subdue, purify, eliminate. At the heart of this machinery was Heinrich Himmler, the architect of administrative terror, who consolidated all the repressive structures under his command: the police, the Gestapo, and the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death Head units responsible for overseeing the camps. Himmler conceived of the camps not only as prisons, but as a tool of social engineering. In them, the state molded its absolute power, physically eliminating those it considered a biological or ideological threat. By 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the race war reached its most extreme point. The camps were no longer just internment centers, but sites of mass extermination. The ideology of living space justified the deportation of millions of people: Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners, the disabled, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and civilians from the occupied territories. The Nazi system became a network of more than 20,000 facilities, including main camps, sub-camps, transit centers, and ghettos. Each fulfilled a function within the machinery of the Third Reich: to produce, to punish, or to exterminate. The difference between a concentration camp and an extermination camp became a matter of purpose, not cruelty. In the former, the aim was to exploit the workforce to the point of exhaustion, in seconds, immediate elimination. The name that encapsulates this transformation is Auschwitz. Opened in 1940 in occupied Poland, Auschwitz began as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, but it soon became the center of the most systematic genocide in history. In 1942, following the Wannsee Conference, where high-ranking Nazi officials planned the final solution, Auschwitz expanded with the creation of Auschwitz II Birkenau, expressly designed for extermination. There, Trains arrived day and night from all corners of Europe. Selection ramps decided the fate of each deportee in seconds. Those deemed fit for work were sent to the barracks. The rest, the elderly, women and children, were led directly to the gas chambers. At Birkenau, Zyklon B, a lethal pesticide capable of killing more than 1,000 people in a matter of minutes, was used. The bodies were then incinerated in crematoria specially built to keep pace with the industrial killing. Auschwitz became the Reich's death factory, but it was not the only one. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno and Majdanek were all part of Action Reinhard, the Polish general government's program for the extermination of Jews. In Treblinka, for example, more than 800,000 people were murdered in less than 2 years. There was no work or long-term imprisonment in these places. Their sole purpose was killing. The Nazis had transformed death into a technical, efficient and impersonal process. Each camp functioned like an assembly line for human destruction. The Nazi bureaucracy recorded the trains, the belongings, the kilos of haircut, the gold teeth extracted, the shoes stacked by the millions. Murder became a matter of logistics. However, the camps served not only to eliminate but also to exploit. In places like Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück, prisoners were forced to work for the German war economy. Companies such as Siemens, IG Farben, BMW, Daimler-Benz, Krupp and Volkswagen used slave labor from the camps. The Monowitz camp, part of the Auschwitz complex, was built exclusively for IG Farben, where prisoners died manufacturing synthetic rubber and fuels. In these places, work was not a means of production but a form of slow execution. Those who failed to meet their daily quota were beaten, executed, or simply left to die. SS doctors like Joseph Mengele took this perversion even further. In the experimental barracks, men, women and children were subjected to atrocious medical tests. Exposure to freezing temperatures, injections of disease-causing agents, amputations without anesthesia, forced sterilizations and genetic experiments. Mengele at Auschwitz selected twins for his studies on heredity and racial purity. The camps became laboratories of absolute evil. Within the system, dehumanization was total. Prisoners lost their names and were identified by a number tattooed on their arm. Internal hierarchies, the kapos, prisoners assigned to watch over others, created an atmosphere of terror and a struggle for survival. Hunger, disease, cold, and summary executions were part of daily life. Despite everything, there was resistance, from individual escapes to collective rebellions, such as those at Sobibor in 1943 and Auschwitz in 1944, where groups of prisoners partially destroyed the crematoria before being massacred. The Nazi system reached its zenith between 1942 and 1944, when extermination became routine administrative practice. Trains loaded with human beings arrived punctually according to the Reich Railway's timetable. The efficiency was so meticulous that the genocide was documented in weekly reports. However, toward the end of the war, as the Soviet army advanced from the east and the Allies from the west, the Nazis began evacuating the camps in death marches. Endless columns of prisoners walking through the snow, without food or shelter, into the German interior. Tens of thousands died along the way. The Nazi system was more than a collection of camps. It was a rational structure of evil, a machine where ideology, science, industry and bureaucracy collaborated to transform death into an industrial process. It was the culmination of a logic that began years earlier in the first Dachau camps, but which in the heat of war transformed into the greatest extermination machine ever created by humankind. In the end, the Third Reich sought not only territorial conquest, but absolute control over life and death, and it did so with administrative precision and ideological fervor. In the Nazi system's concentration and extermination camps, humanity reached its lowest point. There, morality was replaced by orders and compassion by efficiency. Slave labor and silent extermination. In the final years of World War II, as the Third Reich's war machine began to show signs of exhaustion, the concentration camp system became the backbone of the German economy. Slave labor was no longer an accessory to the regime, but a structural necessity. Millions of men, women and children from all the occupied nations were torn from their homes and sent to work in inhumane conditions in factories, mines, construction camps and workshops. Work became a form of silent execution, a death by exhaustion, starvation and torture. What the Nazis called re-educative labor or corrective labor was in reality a policy of progressive extermination. Camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück served not only to eliminate the Reich's enemies, but also to prop up its crumbling economy. From 1942 onward, with the prolongation of the war and the desperate need for labor, the SS established the system of Vernichtung durch Arbeit, death through labor. This policy, firmly supported by Heinrich Himmler and Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, integrated the camps into the Reich's industrial apparatus. Large German corporations were direct accomplices. Siemens, IG Farben, Krupp, BMW, AEG, Daimler-Benz and Volkswagen received prisoners for their factories. At the Auschwitz-Monowitz complex, prisoners worked for IG Farben in the production of synthetic rubber and gasoline under such brutal conditions that life expectancy did not exceed 3 months. At Mauthausen, deportees were forced to carry multi-ton blocks of granite up the quarry stairs, a task that meant certain death from exhaustion or falls. There was no distinction between the camp and the factory. Both were part of the same machine of destruction. The prisoners were not considered human beings, but disposable labor. They were classified according to their physical capacity, and those who could no longer perform were sent to the crematoria. SS doctors monitored this process with bureaucratic precision, determining who would live another day to continue working and who should die so as not to waste resources. In some camps, prisoners were forced to build the very facilities where they would later be murdered, as happened in the Dora Mittelbau subcamps, where thousands died digging tunnels for the production of V-2 rockets, the weapons with which Hitler dreamed of changing the course of the war. In that subterranean hell, without sunlight or ventilation, the workers slept among corpses and breathed the toxic dust of cement and explosives. Workdays stretched to 16 hours and punishments were immediate. A fall, a word, a glance was enough for execution. The Nazis had perfected modern slavery and cloaked it in ideological justification. Work was purification, punishment, and elimination all at once. The slogan above the entrance to Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, was a cruel irony that symbolized the entire logic of the system. In women's camps, such as Ravensbrück, women were also victims of forced labor and medical experimentation. They were used in the textile industry, in the manufacture of munitions and in agricultural tasks, and were subjected to surgical experiments and mass sterilizations. Many died as a result of infections, starvation, or sexual abuse. In the final months of the war, with the advance of the Red Army and the Allies, the Nazis began evacuating the camps into the German interior. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to march for days without food or shelter in what history remembers as the death marches. Those who fell were executed on the spot. Those who survived arrived at makeshift camps where death awaited them from exhaustion or disease. This was the silent extermination, the elimination of prisoners without gas chambers, without large-scale operations, but through neglect and daily suffering. The Reich archives record chilling figures. Between 1940 and 1945, more than 12 million people were subjected to forced labor, of whom nearly half died. The network of slave labor was not limited to the concentration camps. It extended throughout Germany. In Berlin, Hamburg and Munich, factories, workshops and farms operated with deported workers. Even German households employed foreign workers, especially women from the East, under degrading conditions. This mass exploitation was the economic foundation of the Nazi war effort, a system that combined industrial capitalism with ideological barbarity. What was most disturbing was the normalization of the horror. Production reports spoke of personnel losses instead of deaths, and companies competed to obtain more prisoners, aware that their lifespan was short but profitable. At Auschwitz and Buchenwald, the SS even established human lease agreements, charging companies a daily fee for each slave laborer, as if they were rented machinery. In that context, death became a statistic and compassion an obstacle. The silent extermination did not require gas chambers. It was carried out with picks, shovels, endless shifts, hunger and cold. In the logic of the Third Reich, labor was a tool for racial purification and a form of economic extermination. For the Nazis, the prisoner had to serve until the last drop of strength and then disappear without a trace. When the Allies liberated the camps in 1945, they discovered the remnants of this system: skeletal bodies, abandoned workshops, still hot ovens, and mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, hair, and personal belongings that told the silent story of millions of victims. But behind every corpse and every barrack, there was a less visible story, that of slave labor, the silent extermination that turned survival into a prolonged punishment. Not all died in gas chambers. Many were slowly killed by hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the systematic brutality of forced labor. From the early years of the regime, the Nazis understood that the camps could serve not only as instruments of political or racial repression, but also as sources of economic production. With the outbreak of war, this idea was solidified under an inhumane principle: work sets you free, Arbeit macht frei. A phrase displayed at the gates of camps like Dachau and Auschwitz, not as a promise but as a mockery. The camps became the heart of a parallel economy based on slavery. Prisoners of all nationalities, Jews, Poles, Soviets, French, Yugoslavs, Italians, Roma, and even German dissidents, were used as disposable labor in industrial, agricultural, and military projects. The system was organized with bureaucratic precision. The SS Economic and Administrative Office, WVHA, headed by Oswald Pohl, managed contracts with private companies and monitored the optimal utilization of prisoners. Death, in this context, was not a flaw in the system, but part of the calculation. Prisoners were considered resources to be exploited until exhaustion, and once unusable, replaced by other deportees. In camps like Mauthausen, the Wiener Graben stone quarry became a physical hell. Prisoners climbed 186 steps carrying granite blocks weighing over 30 kilograms. Every day hundreds fell and their bodies were replaced without interruption. At Buchenwald, prisoners worked manufacturing weapons, rocket parts and war material for the Reich's industry. In Dora Mittelbau underground, the V-2 rockets that would later bomb London were built. There, more than 20,000 prisoners died in extreme conditions, suffocated by dust, hunger and exhaustion. German companies, many of which still exist today, actively participated in this system. IG Farben, the chemical giant, built factories next to camps like Auschwitz-Monowitz, where prisoners worked themselves to death producing synthetic rubber and fuels. Siemens, Krupp, BMW, Daimler-Benz and Volkswagen profited from forced labor. Prisoners received no wages, barely a crust of bread and watery soup. The workday could exceed 12 or 14 hours without rest under extreme temperatures and with constant surveillance by SS guards. Hunger was the most effective instrument of control. The Nazis knew that a starving prisoner was more docile and less likely to rebel. In some camps, the daily ration amounted to less than 1,000 calories, insufficient even to sustain life. Many died of starvation without ever having been struck. Malnutrition led to disease, and the lack of hygiene and medical care turned any wound into a death sentence. The silent extermination operated as a slow but sure process. The human body was gradually destroyed until only one more number remained to be crossed off the register. From 1942 onward, with the intensification of the war and the shortage of labor, forced labor spread beyond the camps to factories, mines, railways and farms throughout occupied Europe. Millions of civilians were deported from their countries of origin. French, Belgians, Dutch, Ukrainians and Russians were forced to work in Germany under the supervision of the SS or the Tod organization. Many slept in makeshift, unheated barracks and were punished if they failed to meet production quotas. Slave labor became an integral part of the Nazi war effort. Every missile, every tank, every railway line carried the trail of a destroyed life. But beyond economic exploitation, slave labor was also a form of ideological extermination. In Nazi logic, certain groups, especially Jews and Soviet prisoners, were considered Untermenschen, subhuman. Their destruction through labor was a way to degrade them before killing them. The idea was to erase not only their bodies, but their dignity. Labor became torture, a mechanism of progressive annihilation. Women were also victims of this system. In camps like Ravensbrück, thousands were forced to sew uniforms, manufacture ammunition, or perform medical experiments. The conditions were equally inhumane: endless days, beatings, and rape. Pregnant women were executed or forced to have abortions. Children, when not sent to the gas chambers, were used in experiments or simply left to starve to death. As the Allied troops began to advance, The Nazis tried to erase the traces of the crime. Many camps were evacuated and prisoners were forced to march for miles in the cold and snow in what became known as the death marches. Those who could not keep up were executed along the way. In these final months of the Reich, forced labor descended into chaos and despair. Camps burned, factories were abandoned, and bodies were left unburied. When American, British, and Soviet soldiers reached places like Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Auschwitz, what they found defied all human comprehension. Men and women reduced to walking skeletons, children with vacant stares, barracks overflowing with piled-up corpses, and crematorium ovens still filled with ashes. The survivors recounted their stories with broken voices. They had worked to the breaking point. They had watched their comrades die one by one, and yet they had survived. Nazi slave labor was more than an economic tool. It was a manifestation of the ideology of absolute domination. It was practical proof that, for the Third Reich, human life had no value. The camps were death factories where production and extermination coexisted, where the economy fed on destruction and silence was the only possible response to pain. The silent extermination was the less visible side of the Holocaust, but just as cruel. There weren't gas chambers for everyone, but there was hunger, disease, exhaustion, and oblivion. In those camps, death didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came slowly, with the weight of labor and the whisper of the wind over the empty barracks. The end of the Reich and liberation. In early 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under the weight of impending defeat, the concentration camps continued to operate with a mixture of desperation and brutality. The Nazis, aware that their reign of terror was coming to an end, tried to erase all traces of their crimes. Ovens burned day and night, archives were destroyed, mass graves hastily covered, and inconvenient witnesses were eliminated. But the military collapse made maintaining control impossible. With the arrival of the Allied armies, American, British, and Soviet, the world would learn the full extent of the horror. On the Eastern Front, Red Army troops were the first to encounter the remnants of the concentration camp system. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest Nazi extermination complex. What they found surpassed any expectation of cruelty. Mountains of unburied corpses, warehouses overflowing with human hair, prosthetics, toys, and tons of clothing belonging to more than 1 million murdered people. Nearly 7,000 sick and dying prisoners were liberated, the last witnesses to an industrial hell. However, liberation was not an immediate act of redemption. Most of the survivors were too weak to celebrate. They weighed less than 40 kilos, suffered from typhus, tuberculosis, or dysentery, and many died in the following days. In the West, American and British troops advanced through Germany, finding camp after camp that the regime had kept secret or disguised as labor centers. At Buchenwald near Weimar, the Americans discovered still hot crematorium ovens and thousands of bodies piled high. At Bergen-Belsen, the British were confronted with a scene of utter horror. 60,000 living prisoners among 13,000 corpses scattered across the ground. Diseases spread unchecked. The stench of death was unbearable. Footage filmed there was later used as irrefutable proof of Nazi crimes. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of war, were shocked by what they saw. Many had thought the reports about the camps were propaganda exaggerations, but reality surpassed any rumor. Some couldn't bear the sight and vomited, others wept openly. At Dachau, upon seeing corpses piled in train cars and mutilated bodies inside the crematorium, several American soldiers summarily executed SS guards. It was not an act of legal justice, but a human reaction to unspeakable horror. Liberation brought unprecedented humanitarian chaos. Millions of displaced people wandered across Europe, liberated prisoners, forced laborers, orphans, and camp survivors. Many had no home to return to. Their families had been murdered, their villages destroyed. The Allied powers established reception centers, but aid was insufficient and arrived too late. Hunger and disease continued to claim lives even after the fall of the Reich. The liberated camps became makeshift hospitals where military doctors tried to save those who were still breathing. At Belsen, the British Army had to burn the camp to the ground to prevent the spread of typhus. Liberation also exposed a moral and psychological dilemma. How to rebuild a life after living through hell? Survivors faced the trauma of remembrance and the indifference of the world. Some were received with compassion, others with suspicion or incomprehension. In Poland, Ukraine, and Hungary, returning Jews were sometimes attacked by their own neighbors. Liberation did not mean the end of suffering. It was merely the beginning of a struggle for memory and justice. As the Allies gathered evidence, the scale of the system was revealed. Documents, photographs, and testimonies revealed that the camps were not isolated incidents of atrocities, but a state-planned network overseen by the SS, the Interior Ministry, and large German corporations. What had begun as detention centers for political opponents in 1933 had transformed into a machine of racial and economic extermination. The world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The genocide was not the work of a few fanatics, but of an entire society that turned a blind eye. The Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1946, sought to deliver justice. For the first time in modern history, the leaders of a state were tried for crimes against humanity. Images of the camps were projected in the courtroom so that no one could deny what had happened. Many of the accused pleaded obedience to orders, but the evidence was irrefutable. However, justice was biased. Thousands of mid- and low-level officials were never brought to trial. Some went into hiding under new identities, others were recruited by the victorious powers in the context of the Cold War. The victims, on the other hand, were left with physical and emotional scars that never healed. In the final weeks of the Reich, the Nazis had attempted to maintain control through the so-called death marches. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk long distances through the snow without food or rest as Allied soldiers approached. Those who fell were executed on the spot. These marches became the final phase of the extermination, a desperate attempt to erase witnesses and move the killing machine deeper into Germany. For many, liberation came literally in their last moments of life. The fall of Berlin in May 1945 symbolized the end of the nightmare, but it also marked the beginning of a painful revelation. Allied newsreels began broadcasting images of the camps, and the entire world watched in disbelief as the living skeletons, the piles of corpses, and the smoking ovens appeared. Allied societies, like German society, had to stare into the abyss of what human beings are capable of. Liberation, more than a military victory, was a moral confrontation with absolute horror. The camps were not simply prisoner of war camps. They were meticulously designed death factories. In them, modernity and barbarity had merged into a single entity. The end of the Reich revealed that behind every uniform, every order, and every serial number, there was a human choice, and that millions of those choices, obedience, silence, indifference, had allowed the system to exist. Liberation was the closing of a chapter, but not of the pain. Many survivors died soon after. Others lived to bear witness and warn the world. Their voices became the foundation of memory. For when the armies destroyed the camps, they did not only free the prisoners, they also freed the truth. And that truth, etched into the bodies and souls of the survivors, would become the eternal testament that such horror can be repeated if the world remains silent again. The echo of horror, the camps in the post-war period. When World War II ended and the camp gates were opened, many believed that with the fall of the Reich, the concentration camp system would also disappear. But the echo of horror did not vanish with the Allied victory. In the years following 1945, Europe remained a continent of ruins and ghosts. Millions of displaced people, survivors, refugees, orphans, released prisoners, and former combatants wandered aimlessly across a devastated landscape. The camps, far from being immediately demolished, were repurposed. In a tragic twist, places like Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Buchenwald, which had been scenes of Nazi suffering, were transformed into internment camps for Germans expelled from the East, prisoners of war, or suspected collaborators. The barracks that had housed victims now contained former citizens of the Reich fleeing the Soviet advance or undergoing political purges. History seemed to be repeating itself, albeit under new banners. In occupied Germany, the Allies faced a dilemma: what to do with millions of displaced people. In many cases, former concentration camps proved to be the only available spaces for setting up refugee camps. The United Nations, through the newly created UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, attempted to bring order to the chaos. In Dachau, for example, thousands of liberated prisoners continued to live there for months, even years, because they had nowhere else to go. The irony was painful. The survivors remained behind barbed wire, albeit now with the promise of freedom. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even more complex. With the advance of communism, the Soviets established their own network of camps for German prisoners of war, collaborators, and political opponents. In the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, former Nazi camps like Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen were reopened by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Between 1945 and 1950, tens of thousands of people died in the camps from starvation, disease, or summary executions. The terror had changed its name, but not its essence. The post-war period also faced a new kind of denial. In post-war Germany, many citizens preferred not to speak of the camps, considering them a stain best buried with the rubble. During the first few years, material reconstruction took precedence over moral reconstruction. Hunger, cold, and the division of the country between East and West relegated the memory of the genocide to the background. The occupying powers, for their part, also had their own narratives. The Soviets presented the liberation of the camps as proof of their savior role, while in the West, the United States and Great Britain used images of the Holocaust as moral justification for the war. But in both cases, the survivors were marginalized, often without adequate assistance, without homes, without justice. In some camps, such as Bergen-Belsen, epidemics continued to cause deaths even months after liberation. British doctors who worked there described the place as a hell that continued to burn even after the end. In the following years, trials of those responsible began, but these proceedings were slow and selective. While the top leaders were tried in Nuremberg, thousands of lower-ranking officers escaped or reintegrated into society. Some even attained respectable positions in the new Federal Republic of Germany. The survivors, on the other hand, had to rebuild their lives in silence. Many emigrated to Palestine, the United States, or Latin America, carrying with them a trauma that the world was slow to grasp. In Israel, the memory of the camps became part of the national identity, a reminder of the price of Jewish vulnerability. In Germany, the process was slower. During the 1950s and 1960s, talking about the Holocaust was uncomfortable, almost taboo. It was only with the Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt in the 1960s, and with the rise of subsequent generations, that Germany began to confront its past. Meanwhile, in the Soviet bloc, the memory of the Nazi camps was instrumentalized. Anti-fascist victims were discussed, but not Jewish victims. The communist narrative reduced the Holocaust to a crime against humanity in general, erasing its specifically anti-Semitic character. The history of suffering was shaped by politics. In parallel, new camps emerged in other parts of the world. The lesson learned was not enough to stop the repetition. In North Korea, Cambodia, Yugoslavia, and later in Africa, the logic of the camps reappeared with other names and other faces. The 20th century had not buried the idea of mass confinement, it had merely globalized it. In Germany, the former camps were slowly transformed into places of remembrance. In Dachau, the Bavarian government created a memorial in 1965 that became a symbol of Germany's new moral commitment to its past. Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen in East Germany were turned into museums by the communist regime, albeit with an ideological narrative that sought to attribute the horror exclusively to fascism, avoiding a deeper reflection on the universal nature of totalitarianism. With the passage of time, and after German reunification, the political differences between East and West gave way to a common goal, that the camps speak for themselves, that the stone, the barbed wire, and the shadows tell the story. Today, millions of people visit them every year. The cold walls, the empty barracks, and the watchtowers have become silent witnesses to human suffering, temples of remembrance where every step resonates like an echo of warning. However, the passage of time has brought another danger: oblivion. With the death of the last survivors, memory risks becoming history and history routine. The words "never again," repeated so many times, seem to fade in the face of new forms of intolerance, hate speech, and wars that continue to displace thousands of innocent people. The echo of horror is not measured only by the cries of the past, but by how the present chooses to listen to them. The post-war period was not the end of the camps, but the beginning of a silent struggle for truth, for justice, and for memory. A struggle that continues because as long as there are societies capable of forgetting or justifying violence, the system of suffering will always find a way to be reborn under another name, in another place, with another face. Remembering is not a gesture of nostalgia, but an act of resistance. The camps do not only belong to Germany's past, they belong to the past of all humanity. Every barrack, every barbed wire fence, every name carved in stone reminds us that the horror didn't begin with a camp, but with an idea. And ideas, when not confronted with the truth, always find a way to return. Memory as a warning. The story of the concentration camps doesn't end with their liberation. It truly begins the moment the world is forced to confront the magnitude of what it allowed to happen. Images captured by Allied soldiers traveled the globe, revealing a barbarity that defied human comprehension. Piles of corpses stacked like garbage, the vacant stares of survivors who no longer knew if they were alive or dead, ovens transformed into symbols of a man-made hell. Those images didn't just document a crime, they were a mirror in which humanity saw itself. The memory of the camps then became a moral imperative. It wasn't enough to condemn the perpetrators. It was necessary to understand how a cultured, industrialized, and seemingly civilized country had been capable of constructing such an efficient system of extermination. That question persists to this day. After the war, Germany had to grapple with a collective guilt that didn't disappear with defeat. For years, many chose silence, looked the other way, or justified the unjustifiable. The Nuremberg trials set a historic precedent, but they also exposed the limitations of human justice. Only a few leaders were convicted, while thousands of collaborators returned to civilian life, occupying positions in administration, industry, and education. Memory in those years was a silent battle. It was the survivors who kept it alive, who, with their pain and their testimony, defied oblivion. Men and women marked by the numbers tattooed on their arms, who traveled the world to tell what they had seen, to warn new generations that evil does not arise from nothing but from indifference, blind obedience, and the fear of thinking. One of them, Primo Levi, wrote, "It happened, and therefore it can happen again." That phrase became the moral core of all reflection on the camps. Remembering is not a passive act, it is a form of resistance. During the second half of the 20th century, the term concentration camp ceased to be a German historical reference and became a universal concept of horror. In different corners of the world, from Cambodia to Bosnia, from North Korea to Rwanda, the patterns of confinement, forced labor, and dehumanization would be repeated. The lesson of the Nazi camps did not stop the evil, but it did give a name to its mechanism. Memory, when embraced responsibly, can be a break, a warning, a line that must not be crossed. In Germany, over the decades, society confronted its past with an honesty that few countries have achieved. The ruins of the camps were transformed into museums, testimonies were preserved, and schools taught what had been forgotten for years. Not as an exercise in perpetual guilt, but as a promise never to repeat. In Buchenwald, at the entrance to the former camp, a simple inscription summarizes this commitment. Every step toward forgetting is a step toward barbarism. However, the challenge of memory does not belong only to the past. In a world where hate speech, racism, and intolerance resurface with new guises, the echo of the camps continues to resonate. Dehumanization no longer needs uniforms or crematorium ovens. Indifference is enough. The system that allowed Auschwitz didn't begin with gas chambers, but with words, with prejudice, with the acceptance that some lives are worth less than others. That's why the memory of the camps isn't just a story of victims and executioners. It's a warning about what we can all become if we renounce empathy. Every year, when survivors return to the places where they were once prisoners, their steps are slower, their voices more fragile. But behind every testimony lies a force that transcends time, the will for the world to remember. Because forgetting is not neutral. Forgetting always favors the executioner. Today, more than 80 years later, the camps remain the darkest symbol of modernity. They remind us that civilization and barbarism can coexist, that science, bureaucracy, and obedience can unite to destroy instead of build. They remind us that evil doesn't need monsters, but ordinary people who stop thinking. Memory, then, is not just a look back at the past, but a commitment to the present. Keeping the history of the concentration camps alive means protecting the future. It means teaching that suffering cannot become the norm, that human dignity cannot be negotiated, and that no state, ideology, or leader has the right to decide who deserves to live or die. The system of suffering that began in the camps must never be repeated. Therefore, remembering is not an act of sadness, but of responsibility. Because as long as there are voices that tell their stories, images that move us, and consciences willing to listen, memory will remain the wall that separates humanity from the abyss. And in that memory lives the most powerful warning bequeathed to us by the 20th century. Horror can return if the world falls silent again. Throughout this journey, we have come to understand that concentration camps did not appear overnight, nor were they an invention exclusive to the Third Reich. Their roots run deep in modern history, in the shadows of colonialism, in imperial wars, and in the experiments in social control that the powers of the 19th and 20th centuries tested on populations considered undesirable. In Cuba, in South Africa, in the European empires, the idea was sown that imprisoning civilians, separating them, monitoring them, and subjugating them was a legitimate tool of power. That logic, cloaked in military discipline and state bureaucracy, was perfected in the 20th century with a coldness the world had never before witnessed. Concentration camps were the most brutal expression of a way of thinking that reduced human life to a manageable resource, a statistic, a tool at the service of the state. In Nazi Germany, that idea reached its highest form of efficiency and perversion. What began as a system to re-educate and punish political enemies transformed into a machine designed to annihilate entire races, to erase identities, to reduce people to numbers. Each camp, from Dachau to Auschwitz, from Mauthausen to Sobibor, was a cog in a structure planned with military precision and fueled by an ideology that stripped individuals of their humanity. Their murder ceased to be a crime and became a procedure. Extermination was no longer a consequence of war, but its hidden purpose. The terrifying thing is that none of this happened in secret or at the hands of a few fanatics. It was a collective endeavor. Engineers designed the gas chambers, private companies supplied materials, doctors experimented in the name of science, soldiers obeyed orders without question, and millions of citizens looked the other way. Nazi horror was possible because society became accustomed to dehumanization, because morality yielded to obedience, and because lies were imposed as national truth. When the Allies opened the gates of the camps in 1945, they discovered more than skeletal remains and still hot ovens. They discovered the testament to the moral failure of modern civilization. What was revealed in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen was not only German barbarity, but also humanity's universal capacity to justify the unjustifiable when convinced that the other does not deserve to live. The images of the survivors, the mountains of human hair, the shoes, the suitcases, the gold teeth did not merely document a crime, they were the physical evidence of a perfectly organized system designed to destroy every last trace of humanity. Since then, the camps have become an enduring symbol of warning. But that warning has often been ignored. After the end of Nazism, new camps appeared in other wars under other names with new pretexts. Prisoner of war camps, detention centers, internment zones. History repeats itself when memory weakens. Remembering Auschwitz is not an act of contemplation, it is an ethical duty. Because concentration camps speak not only of the past, but also of the present and the future, of every dictatorship that persecutes, of every border that encloses, of every minority stripped of its rights. The origin of concentration camps in reality is the origin of human indifference. It is the moment when the suffering of others ceases to matter to us. And for this reason, as long as there are places where torture is practiced, where people are imprisoned without justice, where dignity is denied, the echoes of those camps will remain alive. May the memory of this horror not be merely a museum, but a mirror in which humanity sees itself reflected and learns once again that civilization is not measured by its progress, but by its compassion.